All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Karen Smith, and I'm a professor of international relations at the LSE. Welcome to this LSE Ideas event on women in climate diplomacy, which is going to discuss, debate, and so on the implications of the fact that climate delegations are gender imbalanced in in international climate negotiations. So what we want to discuss is the implications of this gender division of labor and how it might be overcome. And I am pleased that we have three incredible experts joining us this evening with a wealth of experience. I'll introduce them briefly in the order that they will speak, and then I'll introduce some of the questions that they will discuss. They'll each speak for about 5 to 7 minutes, and then we will welcome questions from you all. And I am sorry to say, however, that Denai has to leave 15 minutes early, but we will obviously continue until 7:30 p.m. UK time. So I am delighted to introduce the three speakers. First of all, we have who has long experience working in various other UN organizations, including UNDP and UNEP, the United Nations Environmental Program. Secondly, we have Denai Kyriakopoulou, who is a senior policy fellow at the Grantham Research Institute at LSE. She's also has extensive experience as director of research of the Official Monetary and Financial Institution Forum, setting up Sustainable Policy Institute, and has been an economist also at the Center for Economics and Business Research. Then lastly, but not leastly, of course, Bernice Lee is the Hoffman Distinguished Fellow for Sustainability and the Research Director at Chatham House. She's worked a lot on the politics of climate change. She's been involved with various and sundry initiatives such as the UK Global Research Initiative Task Force and the UK Climate Change Committee's International Advisory Group. So the three speakers, the three panelists that we have this evening are going to start by addressing some questions about the role of women in climate diplomacy, including, we're interested to hear them address questions such as, how has the context for women in diplomatic negotiations changed over the course of your career? What do you think still needs to be done to improve women's representation in climate diplomacy? And what role do women have in helping the planet reach urgent climate goals? So we'll go in the order that I introduced the speakers. So I will hand the floor, as it were, the virtual floor, over to Amira. Amira, over to you. Thank you very much and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Karen. And good evening, good afternoon, good morning. I'm assuming that there are participants that are connecting from different time zones. And I'm very honored and pleased to be part of this panel. And I'd like to start by saying that I have had a career journey that has allowed me to witness the change, the progress of the climate change convention, negotiations under this convention. And in the course of these years, I have had the privilege to see how that has changed. By the way, I have attended 25 out of 26 COPs, and during these processes, either as a government representative or as a UN observer organizations, I have witnessed the change even in the paradigm for the climate diplomacy, which I think is a very important aspect and relates to the first question that Karen has posed to us. So what has changed in the context? And indeed, there is change. There is change in the paradigm of the climate diplomacy. And for those who have been attending these conferences of the parties, which I think are the center of the climate change discourse, they might have seen, like I have, the change in the paradigm of the climate diplomacy, and the change has been made in different aspects. In my view, Paris Agreement is the culmination of the efforts to come up with a treaty, and with a treaty that brings together all parties to achieve an objective of the convention. The Paris Agreement was very successful in shifting from differentiation of responsibilities into something that is called nationally determined contributions, which bring a bottom-up structure for emission reductions. In early 90s, UNFCCC was centered around state actors only, but later negotiators started understanding that current pledges by national governments are not enough to reach the goal of Paris Agreement. So UNFCCC process started now slowly shifting right after the Copenhagen COP to get together people more than state actors by bringing different stakeholders together. And that has been seen since Paris, indeed. I attended the last COP in Glasgow, and the voice of youth, women, and indigenous people, as well as religion leaders and faith communities, stood out there and was stronger than ever in Glasgow. And I haven't seen that happening before. Another aspect of change is issues around the convention. So before Copenhagen, it was just climate change. It were mainly either ministries of foreign affairs or ministries of environment that were dealing or were attending or representing the delegates, the countries under the convention. But later, and as it was acknowledged by the reports, assessments of the IPCC, which I work for, climate change was identified and was acknowledged, not just an environmental issue. So here came the need for having more items, more issues into the table. So all of these three elements, these aspects that I have just mentioned, make the context for climate diplomacy, which basically changed since Paris. And that is the context that we need to see also the women engagement in this process. So as I said, the context changed, and that context opened the door for more progress, more involvement of women. And it's quite obvious that climate diplomacy has given more space to women, and figures, can confirm that. Paris Agreement states that when parties take action, they have to consider gender parity and gender equality. And indeed, in the first decision on gender, which was made, if not mistaken, in 2001, was followed by a program of action in 2014 in Lima called Lima Program of Action, which was culminated then with a gender action plan of UNFCCC. So that shows that there is a lot of progress. There is a lot of progress in the UNFCCC context. And like UNFCCC, I'm very pleased to share with you that IPCC, the organization that I'm working for, is progressing a lot. And figures show that in both organizations, you have representation at 30% share of women in when it comes to UNFCCC in the delegations, in IPCC in the authorship of the reports that we are producing. By the way, there is a very interesting article that has been published in Nature magazine that comes up with some very interesting data. It's called Survey of Gender Bias in IPCC. I'm going to put the link in the chat box, and the participants are invited to look at it and get to understand what's going on there. Look at the progress, but as it is stated at the beginning, there is a lot of space for work identified as a gap, and there is a lot of work that is needed to be done. Also, we are working to improve everything on that aspect. There is another question from Karen about the role of women in helping the planet to reach the urgent climate goals. And that goes together with what is done. I mean, what needs to be done, in my view. So I'll start very quickly summarizing the role of women, which I think is the root of the assessment of why women need to be at the table, why women need to be more represented in the climate negotiations and climate diplomacy. We have acknowledged in IPCC reports that women are affected by climate more than men. I myself have witnessed how women are affected, how vulnerable they are, in particular women from the South, women who do not have access to resources to adapt. And of course, as we also state in our reports of IPCC, and as you all might have heard, the world is on track to reach 1.5 degree in less than 2 decades. And as we speak, the planet has reached the 1.1, around 1.1 degree of warming. So basically that requires, and Paris Agreement is still achievable. So I think this is where we need to start looking at in terms of the perspective, in terms of what is needed to be done. So women are affected. This is the first thing. And there needs to have a shift. There needs to have a transformation to achieve the goal of Paris Agreement, to stay within 1.5 degree. And women have to be there. Women have to be part of this need for transformation, because this requires a transformation. And as I said, they are the ones that are affected more than men. So women must be at the forefront and must lead the transformation. We need to have them sitting in the negotiating tables. We have seen in the course of the years that they are attending negotiations. Women diplomats have been there, but most of the heads of delegations, we have seen that they are coming from male community. So there is need to have them there. But I think, and that brings me to the last point about what needs to be done. I think we need to get women not to be present in the meetings. We have seen in Glasgow many women and girls, but they were more on the activist part. So getting women to not just be there, but also speak up, stand out, and speak of the needs, speak of the opportunities that they can offer, bring their vision about the way that the climate crisis needs to be addressed, I think is part of the solution. And then that goes together with training that is needed to access technology and finance, which are very important to adapt to climate change. And women diplomats, I think, need to be leading also on that front, and also be part of the training when it's needed. Climate ambition requires gender aspect to be properly managed. And I see the national determined contribution, which sit in the heart of Paris Agreement, to be the entry point for bringing the gender dimension at the national level, and from the national level to the global level. Allying with men is another aspect. Getting to work with men colleagues and have them speak about gender, I think, is something that is definitely needed to be brought in the table. Mentoring young women and educating them is something that I've also heard everywhere. I attended quite a few gender events in Glasgow, and I heard this coming over and over, and this is absolutely true. I am very pleased to have mentored so far many young UN professionals, but at the same time, as an Albanian woman and UN staff member, I have been honored and privileged to be mentored by male colleagues in my career development. So training, education, mentoring are the aspects that we need to consider in terms of what needs to be done. And on a closing note, there is a gender gap in climate diplomacy, and this needs to be filled, definitely. By the way, there are other areas which gender needs to be considered. And by doing that in gender diplomacy, we are contributing to bring the gender dimension in other sectors for the reasons that I mentioned, because gender and climate together have to do with all the sectors of economy. They require the bringing of other sectorial ministries and all the stakeholders together. And despite that gap, I think women have managed to show that they can do well, as they have been doing even during the pandemic. Studies suggest that female-led countries handled coronavirus better. Here is what I wanted to close it with now for my first intervention, and thanking you all for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We'll move on now to Danai.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and very important that you're organizing this event and spotlighting this issue. So thank you for that. I suppose the starting point is, why are we talking about this? Why is it still an issue that women in climate diplomacy, as in many other fields, are underrepresented or perhaps not as visible as they should be? And why do we care about this? Why is it an issue? Does it matter whether women are visible and active participants in climate diplomacy? And I would argue that they do, and I think this is for quite a few reasons. And number one is that climate is the biggest challenge we are facing, and simply we need all the brains we can get in that room. And if there are reasons that mean that women are struggling to reach those positions, then that is something that we should care about, because we need the best people to address this crisis, and we need men, women from all, we need people from all sorts of groups to be participating and be at this table, because otherwise we're losing out, because we're not making use of the best talent and the best pool of talent that we can have as humanity to solve this crisis. So I think that's a very important reason why we should care about the lack of women. The second reason is because diversity matters in the way decisions are made, and in diplomacy this matters very much. We need to have diverse opinions. We need to have different groups represented in the room that can bring different perspectives. If you have the same group of people thinking in the same way, coming from the same background, same gender, same other characteristics, it's not just about gender, it's not about men and women, it's about the benefits of diversity in thinking and in decision making more broadly, that can enhance the way and the solutions that we come up with in the climate challenges. And that's something that was very evident in other crises and other challenges that we faced. If you look back to the financial crisis, for example, there's been a lot of studies showing that the male-dominated aspect of financial policy making at the time led to this kind of groupthink and this kind of myopia that some have argued contributed to an extent to the financial crisis. So having more diverse voices in the room also helps with better decision making. Another reason, and Mira mentioned that as well, is mirroring the society that we serve, because climate as a crisis affects men and women differently. And we need to have a group that makes those decisions, that is at the negotiating table, that leads those diplomacy efforts, that represents the society that is affected differently by those decisions. And again, that is not just about gender, that is about diversity more broadly. And we at the Grantham Research Institute at the LSE are also doing some research on that, on how climate is affecting men and women differently, and it's something that the IPCC report has acknowledged as well. So that's another important reason. I think also it's role models is another reason to have more women in visible positions, and climate diplomacy, role models, women leaders in the climate space can be very important for that. You mentioned, Ermira, the activists that are very visible, and that is certainly in the cover of this event. We have Greta out there, and she's certainly a very visible figure that has inspired many girls around the world to follow on her steps. And we need to see that also at the higher leadership levels, because otherwise we're not going to have little girls saying, I want to solve the climate crisis, if they don't see people like them being there. So we are lowering the chances that talented people who may have a lot to contribute follow those paths, follow those steps, because they don't see people like them be in those positions, and they cannot dream or imagine themselves being there. And maybe if I can add a more cheeky fourth reason, let's say, and Ermira mentioned that as well, how women leaders were praised to do better in the COVID crisis. And that's something that others have spoken about as well. In an interview, Christine Lagarde, when she asked about the lessons of the COVID crisis, she said it's that women can do it better. And to an extent, I do not subscribe to that. I think it's much more about diversity. It's not that women can do it better or can be better at climate diplomacy, but to an extent, it is true that for women who have had to face many more hurdles to get to those positions, they have had to have certain characteristics to get there. Just statistically, they're more likely, because they've had to go through more hurdles, to be more perseverance, tenacity, problem solving, finding solutions are all characteristics that they have had to get to where they are. So that could be another reason, and that is linked to the saying that we often hear, that we will only achieve equality when we have mediocre women in positions of power as well. So at the moment, to be a woman in a position of influence in climate diplomacy or other fields, it means that it's already passed those checks. So I would say perhaps that's another reason. So this is why we need to address this. And then I think it'd be interesting in the discussion also to look at the how. And Karen, you asked about this in your introduction. How can we overcome this? And I like the hashtag for this year's, the 2022 International Women's Day, which is break the bias, because this is something that we all humans are subject to. And when I look at my teams, I often discover that I myself have sometimes a bias to hire more women or look more favorably towards women. It's important to be aware of those unconscious biases and deal with them and actively try and come against them. And when it's a field is more male dominated, like climate diplomacy maybe at the moment, how do we overcome this, and how can we actively have methods and tools to promote the role of women if we feel and we know that the current situation is lacking because of all the reasons I described. I think there is more balance in the entry levels. That is true of all fields. The problem happens as we progress up. And in the case of climate diplomacy, you often have more senior negotiators that are more visible. It's people later on in their career. So even if there is more people interested in climate and climate diplomacy, climate policy in more junior levels, how do we support men and women in equal ways to progress and reach those levels where their decisions can actually have an effect? And Ermira also mentioned mentoring. I would also say that that's another very important tool that we can use, informal, but also more organized ways of doing that. And I think it's also thinking about, especially when we talk about climate and climate diplomacy, it's about thinking about what team do we want to have? And it's not always that we want to choose the best individual with the best skills, because we're talking about teams that are working together. So having the best team sometimes may be different than having a collection of the best individuals who, for many reasons that we know in terms of the way that men's and women's careers have progressed, it may be that the most qualified person may be a man because they have had these opportunities that women in previous in generations have not had. But how do we make up the best team that can have the biggest influence? And that goes back to the point about diversity. So I think changing the way we think, addressing our biases, and actively looking to address this, not as something that will solve itself simply because women are now more educated, more interested in climate. We know that it affects them differently, and that simply through time passing, we will have the generation of Greta becoming the leaders that will lead the climate diplomacy negotiations, and it will all be fine. I don't think so. I think we need to actively address it, and I look forward to the discussion of how we can do this. And apologies that I will have to leave earlier, but I hope I can have some time for some of the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Over to you, Bernice.
Thank you very much, and I'm really very glad to be here as well today. I'm going to be very brief. I want to focus on three things. I want to focus on, first, how do we have to make sure that this is a self-evident issue to one that is based on evidence? The second thing is that I want to talk a little bit about how, in a way, we have to move it from being a daddy versus mummy issue to a co-parenting issue. And these are the reasoning, I think, that I would like to sort of go through a little bit today. Look, I mean, it's obvious that the rationale for more women in climate diplomacy is evident, is self-evident in many ways, as both Amira and also Danai has mentioned, that it is actually very importantly a quality of good governance, which is one of the reasons why it is important that we start there. But at the same time, what is actually helpful is that in recent years, we're seeing more and more evidence of that as well in play. I should add that this is really at best a hobby for me, as I said, even though I've been involved in many years in climate diplomacy related issues and discussions. My colleague Nina Jeff, I understand, is also attending here today, is the one who wrote an excellent article for China Dialogue, which has covered many of these issues. So I must confess that all the evidence that I will be able to provide is really owed to her briefing and her excellent thinking on this subject so far. For example, there's a study that was published not so long ago looking at how in 91 countries, that countries with more women parliamentarians indeed are having more stringent, for example, climate policies. We're also looking at a women's barometer has a survey done not so long ago, actually only a couple of months ago, looking at how women are more likely to take stronger action on climate change, and that they're more likely to take on more stringent action in using nudging and behavioral shift as part of the way to meet the environment-related goals. Now, I think this is quite important that we have to move the discussion from an assumption of self-evident rationale to one that is really based on evidence. And I think both are going to work well in terms of supportive of the improvement of quality of women engagement. The second thing I want to say is, before I move on to the mommy and daddy versus co-parenting issue, is that I think that despite the context change that Amira talked about, the reality is that at all levels, grass top, grass roots, as well as grass middle level, we are seeing the disparity staring in our face. Many, despite better numbers in Glasgow, we are still looking at, all the numbers are telling you that the number of delegations with female heads are far too little. All the numbers are telling us that at the grassroots level, access to decision-making, access to tools that could actually help meet climate goals at the grassroots level are all also rather wanting. And at the grass middle level, I'm going to talk a lot about how there's an unreported side around how, even though despite many women are playing very key roles in these delegations and negotiations and also in real life decision making on climate change, a lot of their work are often not reflected in the representation. So I think IPCC and definitely UNFCCC have come up with all these analysis about why is it that so many more men speak than women, even though the women tend to be the one doing all the work. So I'm saying that on the both grass top, on the triple level, grass top, grass bottom, and grass middle level, we're seeing the disparity, which means that despite the contextual shift and more awareness, which is definitely the big change, we're not really moving all of this fast enough. And I wonder whether or not by moving from Copenhagen, I think that was mentioned by Amira, which I hope that was not something that we are drawing any lessons from, but certainly from Paris to Glasgow, we are moving from, in some ways, the definition of the problem, the rationale of the why, and the what to the how. And this is, I think, where the whole kind of, when we are really focusing on target setting, ambition raising, of course, we need to raise the political temperature. And this is, I realized recently that almost everything I know about the world comes from television series, The West Wing, where they were explaining what is a daddy issue versus the mummy issue. So that is why often people want to move the agenda up the political spectrum by talking about security, securitization, etc. But at the same time, what is becoming quite clear is that while that is an important part of the solution, it is not the whole story. We also need what would be, I call it to the West Wing, the mummy issue, which is about economic shift, management of the economy, etc., as part of the solution. And as we move that from the climate issue, from sort of daddy versus mummy to one of co-parenting, then we know that we need all of those aspects to be part of the solution, and increasing awareness that we are in some ways really building the car while we are driving at the same time. This means that we need the kind of skill set that is often associated with feminine leadership, which I know that it's not the same thing as women in leadership, which are about being more cooperative, solution seeking, etc., of the type that I think that Nai also talked about just now in terms of pandemic leadership style. So I think that for these reasons, I think that these are some of both the contextual shift as well as I think the rationale for more women in climate diplomacy and leadership position. So that is how we need to move from self-evidence to more evidence-based decision-making, how we move from what to how and the why to how. This means that we need to move from a daddy versus mommy to one that is much more co-parenting when it comes to finding climate solutions. And thank you very much for your attention.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Bernice. Thanks for all of our panelists. We've got a lot to discuss, and there are a couple of questions that have already come in that do kind of both are sort of regarding the role of men and what role men can play. Particularly, I think there's one specific question on men as mentors. What should they do? And so we can. I'd ask the panelists to consider that question. I think we'll begin with Danai because just because of the time issue. But I'd also like you to think. I mean, everybody's sort of mentioned, we need to get there. If I could press you a little bit on, do you think we're actually, the prospects for actual change? I mean, how good are the prospects for a cooperative leadership, as Bernice just said? Are things looking good, or are we still in a very position of not much change at all? Anyway, let's go. We'll start with Danai, and then perhaps Mira, just because of the time issue of Danai needing to leave early. So over to you.
Thank you, Karen. Maybe I'll start with your second question about the kind of glass full, half empty. And I would be more optimistic on this because I think we are in a good place now. And every year you see that we're celebrating appointments for more and more women. I mean, now in Europe, we have a woman heading the parliament, the central bank, the commission, and it's really, we are seeing this change come very regularly and at a great pace. But at the same time, the fact that we continue to celebrate this important appointments shows that it's still an issue. So we still have a long way to go, but I am optimistic. I think there is a lot of great work being done. The IPCC also in the area of climate, and we are seeing now gender be very much recognized as one of the central issues around the transition as well within the context of the just transition question. So I think we are seeing progress, but we need to be very aware that this is not something that's going to happen by itself, and we need to have the right policies for it to happen. Now, on the role of men, I think that's a really interesting question because often we have this fear among men that women becoming more prominent in some of these fields is going to come at the detriment of men. And I think that's the kind of shift that we need to see in terms of the viewpoint of the fact that having more women in those positions is actually making the situation better for everyone, because we are getting the better pool of talent to be involved in this, and that means that everyone benefits out of this. And the climate crisis is something that affects us all, and having the best brains in the room is something that both men and women are going to be benefiting from. And I think that kind of shift in the view is going to be very important, because men are going to be important in this, not just as mentors. Mentoring is one aspect. And personally, I've had more relationships with female mentors. I think the kind of role that men should see themselves as is not the kind of mentoring towards women. That is part of it, but it's often the fact that women may be shut out of the old men's club, and that's why these kind of appointments are very important, because they show that it is possible to enter this and be part of this, and it's not that women are missing out because the conversations are happening behind closed doors among the kind of men's club and the boys club. And I think that's something that needs to be emphasized, and men need to be seen as allies, and they need to be supporting women in visible ways, not just through mentoring, but through pushing for these policies that I described in terms of making sure that we can have support for women to progress to those positions. So I would say that that would be a role for men. But in terms of mentoring, it's also helping women see things from a different perspective and contributing a conversation in a different way. And that's something that women can also mentor towards men. So it's about the diversity of thought and learning from each other, and the different ways of experiences and thoughts that men and women may have in this policy area.
Great, thank you. Amira, what's your take?
I fully agree. I fully agree with what Dana said, and just to add in here that yeah, there is progress, and I mentioned that earlier, and I mentioned a few figures that show that there is some progress over the years. And there is a 30% and 33% UNFCCC and IPCC over the 30 years. This 30, it took 30 years. This figure, it took 30 years to the organizations to come up with some progress, with better representation of women. But we need, in terms of addressing climate crisis, as I said, there is less than 2 decades ahead of us to act. And the world needs to act fast. And in order to do so, we can't wait for that pace, of 30 years to achieve a 30. So to achieve gender parity, at least by the time, we can't wait for that to be achieved and then to act. So these two have to go in parallel, which means that there needs, again, for another paradigm to shift in terms of getting women, to engage together with men equally in the process of addressing the climate crisis. And in addition to all the steps and actions that I have mentioned, and also those that the previous speakers have, I just wanted to say that we need men who can lead this transformation. We need men like the Secretary General of United Nations, Antonio Guterres, who, the moment that he took over that post, he announced his priority for gender parity. We need gender to be gender parity to be aggressively put and embedded into the other agendas. For example, in the United Nations, you can barely hire a man if you have a woman who has competed for a post and has been proposed by the panel, and in particular when she comes from developing countries. So there is a system that is put in place in the United Nations system where you have to make sure that gender parity targets are achieved. So by 2028, there should be a gender parity in the United Nations system, and there is a lot of progress done in this direction. And I'm proud to be part of this team and the leadership of the IPCC, where we have done our best, and we're trying to implement and embed this in our daily actions.
Thank you. Bernice, do you want to?
Oh, I mean, I think that look, the problems are well known. So it's not that we don't know what needs to be done. But I have a feeling that oftentimes in the past, we think of what I described earlier on as the grass top versus grass bottom issues as being separate buckets of issues, when at the moment it is becoming clearer that they are all connected, because obviously better, grassroots access lead to better access to decision making, and thereby empowering those at the top to gain higher position as well at the same time. So I think that perhaps one way I would propose forward is to make sure that we are cognizant of the linkages between the grassroots versus grass middle versus grass top disparities and how they're interconnected. Maybe that, connecting them analytically may help us actually figure out a better way to make a more consistent and comprehensive case for women in climate emergency or gender equality in general. The second thing is that if there are no shortcuts about doing everything right, then we need to develop the sharper end of the toolkit. The sharper end of the toolkit, obviously, in diplomacy, what is it? It's just naming and shaming and not putting up with those who are not actually doing the right thing. So I think there is a combination of making sure that the pieces are connected and not see them as separate buckets, even within those who are proposing gender equality at different levels. And secondly, really hone in on the sharper end of the toolkit in such a way that we can bring the kind of name and shame that is effective in other areas into it. Now, having said all of this, you ask about prospects, and I'm looking at the world right now. I'm thinking about energy prices. I'm thinking about Ukraine. I'm thinking about everything that is happening in the world right now, and how hard it has been, and it will continue to be, to focus attention. So this means that we can't afford to wait for other issues to be resolved until we focus on this as well, which means that we've got to solve all the problems at the same time. So embedding this as part of every decision has to be part of the way forward, or else we will always take second and third seat before we get to the point where we feel that gender parity and equality and etc. become really an important toolkit that we know is one of the secret weapons that we have yet to utilize as best we could, despite the knowledge and the evidence speaking in support for really quite a while. Thank you.
Thank you. A question came in, and I'm going to ask Carmen to clarify in the Q&A, and then I'll ask it again. Just are still there and could just put that into the Q&A, I'd be very grateful. But we have another question from Chatham House, from Nina Jeffs at Chatham House. For the panelists, which says, do you see the key barriers preventing women's progression to leadership positions in climate diplomacy as similar or different to barriers contributing to a glass ceiling in other industries? Are there any unique challenges that require unique solutions? And I would just add here, for example, there's been work that's done on the so-called critical mass. That this particular theory has been criticized, but then also demonstrated. Except there's a big debate about it. But do we have to have a critical mass of women involved in climate negotiations before we start to see change? Another thing that has been used outside of the context of climate diplomacy is quotas. Specifying quotas for female participation in, say, delegations or negotiations. So if you could address those, and then we'll see if we can come back to Carmen's question in a second. We'll start, Danai, if you just have 2 minutes. I know that you need to leave in 2 minutes if you want to address that first. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question. I think to a large extent, they are very similar, the kind of barriers that women face when we talk about leadership. But I think in the case of climate, maybe they are exacerbated to an extent because a lot of the subjects that or the expertise that women would need to have to be in those positions are from subjects that are where women are very underrepresented. In the case of science or finance, for example, a lot of these subjects do suffer from fewer women in higher positions, unlike some other areas. So I think that is one reason why, especially in climate policy, there is an underrepresentation of women. And as in other areas, it's also maybe that particular laws, for example, related to land use, that's not so much in terms of climate diplomacy, but in terms of how climate is affecting men and women differently, that is also affecting the way that women may be disproportionately hit by climate change and their ability to influence decision making, particularly in some, say, rural societies or developing economies where these barriers may be very evident for women. And I'm afraid I will have to leave after that, but we'll watch the rest, and very interesting to have this discussion with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for participating. And I'm sorry that we're going to lose you for the last 15 minutes, but thank you very much. Amira.
Yes. What can I say? Gender is also interconnected with other factors, and I think that came also earlier on. But let me mention that again, also from the perspective of its interconnection with other factors such as race, ethnicity, language, disability, age, diversity, expertise, or nationality. That are the source of the bias that we can see when women tend to join different networks, different clubs, and of course when they apply for leadership positions. But the situation is not everywhere the same. While there are barriers that all women can face, there are also processes where we can see progress. I don't want to repeat what I said, but the word quota was mentioned, and this has to do with, for example, in the UN system, there is a quota, there is a target, which is not the case for delegations, for women participation in UNFCCC delegations or even IPCC delegations. In the meetings, in the sessions, UNFCCC or IPCC, we have seen a change recently, and in the last 2 years, mainly because of the pandemic, because of the shifting from the in-person to remote sessions, which has allowed for larger participation in the sessions, meaning bringing in more women, bringing in more diversity and inclusion, And that is an evidence, a very good evidence of what, women can do if they are there. What is the benefit of having more views, more input, more feedback, including from women.
Great, thank you. That will bring me to Carmen's question in just a second. But first, let's hear from Bernice.
Oh, thank you. It's just a question, and also Karen, thanks for chipping in as well on the critical mass question. I think that, I mean, I'm going to say with very little knowledge that I'm assuming everything helps at this point, and therefore that would be one such strategy, definitely. But at the same time, as I think Danai said earlier, which is that this is the sort of the disparity in the foreign ministry is reflected back onto some of the supporting agencies or related agencies, which are about energy, about science and technology, about engineering, etc. So I think we can't get away from the fact that it is about righting the disparity elsewhere as well, in terms of STEM education, in terms of, the practitioners in energy, transport sector, etc., etc. And until such time, we can't really write the whole picture. But at the same time, I mean, obviously the two things are related. And so I would say, let's throw everything in, critical mass quotas, none of which can harm necessarily. But at the same time, I don't think that there are shortcuts, as I said, it will be a reflection of society. But at the same time, if climate action area and climate adaptation area can take leadership position in having right some of the wrongs. And I think Carmen's question, one of them is pointing to that about the finance question in terms of access to finance, whether or not that is indeed one such lever that could be better utilized on the basis of the disparity now actually inhibiting the role of women, both in terms of mitigation as well as adaptation as well. So I would like to hear more as well from Amira and others in terms of how would you respond to the question that, I think Carmen had two questions there when I looked at it. So one of them was on the business case that she clarified, the other one was on climate finance, I think, but yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Yes, I think Carmen's question was sort of also about, do we need more research or do we need action? I mean, in other words, and how are we going to, do we really need to kind of keep researching what the potential benefits are of women in climate leadership, or do we just simply need action? But it would be interesting to hear, I think, also from Amira and Bernice, obviously, on the kind of the differences that more women might be able to make. If we have more women involved in climate negotiations, what kind of differences might this make, in the short term, even, or short to medium term? Any views? Bernice, did you want to go first? Or
happy to. I mean, I think that I cited the studies about women parliamentarians, as well as obviously the Women's Barometer research in terms of willingness to take ambitious action. So therefore, one has to assume, even though one cannot prove a correlation. And in fact, the study on the parliamentarians talking about the presence of more women parliamentarians and stronger climate action is causal relationship. So I think that would be the evidence that we need. Now, in terms of whether or not we need evidence or just doing, I think we need both. I mean, we cannot take anything for granted. So I think that gathering evidence and proving the case is going to be, is going to be as important as ever if we can't take anything for granted. But at the same time, doing is also important. But I think doing more would largely be contingent on our ability to prove the business case and prove that it is actually beneficial as well. So I think that the two things, again, are interrelated and shouldn't be taken separately. And we need to do as well as continue to prove our case at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you. Amira.
Yes, I agree with Bernice to the extent that we need both. We need both. We can't pick one or the other. We need both, and we need both simply because we can't wait for the research. And I think what the studies are showing so far are good enough to push for getting women and support their inclusion, their representation in the delegations, in the decision making, for them sitting in the table, and that is part of the paradigm that needs to be changed. There was also a question. I mean, part of the question is the difference that women can make. Bernice mentioned studies about the parliamentary women that have contributed so far. I have also read some references to the studies that show that there is a correlation between those countries which have more women in their parliaments, and statistically they have more a larger number of the approved conventions, I mean ratified conventions that have to do with environment, or a larger number of protected areas, and more action that has to do with the protection of environment and the health of the population. So that shows that human face and women face of the action. And I read somewhere in, you know, preparing for this event, I read somewhere that some women in Glasgow, they were referring to climate change having the women face, and I would agree with that.
Thank you. So, if anyone from the audience would like to contribute more questions, please do. Please use the Q&A function. But I have one sort of factual question that I wanted to throw in to you all. Do women involved in climate negotiations, is there a network? I mean, I know that there are networks of women, you know, I mean, there's groups, for example, of women foreign ministers who meet and so on. Are you organized in that way as well at the international level? Women involved in climate negotiations? Are there networks? Yeah, Amira?
Yeah, there has been a network of women from the South, which has been, I think, is rooted from the projects and programs that, in particular, United Nations system has provided to the support to climate negotiators. I have spent quite a few years in supporting developing countries, and in particular LDCs, in programming, on climate change programming, with funds coming from the global funds, including the Global Environment Facility, Adaptation Fund, and lately the Green Climate Fund. So there are initiatives in place, and of course these initiatives have not only contributed towards increasing their capacity to negotiate, but at the same time they have helped them, you know, set up the network. And there are networks, for sure. There are networks of women from the South who participate in climate change negotiations. And I also have my own networks from the early days, in early 90s. My first COP was in 96, when the so-called Berlin Mandate process started, which gave birth to the Kyoto Protocol. And from these early days, I still have connections with networks, including with women who I met in climate change negotiations, and we became very close friends. And I continue to, you know, engage with them, and in addition to meeting them in, you know, on Skype, I look forward to meeting them in person. And Glasgow was, you know, very, very good to see, a very good moment to see them after a 2 years break. So yeah.
Great. Bernice, I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
Yeah, I was just pondering about, obviously, as Amira said, we're all part of many informal networks, and informal doesn't mean disorganized. It could be informal and organized. And I think time indeed will help us figure out in terms of the effectiveness of those intersecting with some of the more formal structures as well at the same time. Now, one of the things that I think Amira mentioned at the beginning, which I want to emphasize a little bit, was that while there has been obviously quite a lot of disparity in terms of leadership, etc., positions for formal government positions, it's clear that in terms of the civil society, the representation is a bit more balanced. And there is, of course, a question about whether or not, therefore, expanding decision-making into more non-state actors and the civil society would indeed be part of the solution as well. And it's a way of expanding both the effectiveness in terms of climate diplomacy, as well as more ambition in terms of climate action at the same time. So I think that definitely these are not necessarily about informal networks when they are talking about civil society, but at the same time, I think the interface between the two are to be watched, definitely. Especially, I mean, this amazing news recently announced that the head of Greenpeace International, Jennifer Morgan, is going to be the German climate envoy, herself an American. I mean, we're talking about the meeting of different worlds at the moment. And I think that in order to achieve effective climate action, we need to be much more bold in terms of embracing and making sure that different worlds come together, collide in a way that actually bring forth more stronger, more ambitious climate action, and not just fireworks. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. One last question from the audience, an extremely important one from Clarence. How can we help women from developing countries to participate in climate change issues and be recognized? So this is, shall we start with Amira? Do you want to start?
Yes, I think that that question has, I think, relates somehow to what I've just mentioned, because as far as I know, there have been support provided, financial support for participation, training on the negotiating elements, regular updates, because it's been 26 COPs so far, and for people who come in the middle of the journey, there needs to have updates, they need to have some additional information to make them, you know, get aware and get familiar. It is, think about just acronyms, you know, in this process. I remember myself, even though I was lucky to join at the very beginning. So basically, what I want to say is that there are programs and projects. I'm no longer part of those. I've changed my job since April 2020. But what I left behind, at least from the UNEP side, was that there were programs and projects that the Global Environment Facility, and there is a dedicated fund for LDCs that were in place, which provide support to negotiators from developing countries and from least developed countries on how to negotiate and get ready for each and every milestone that the climate change process goes through. So I wonder whether that helps, but in case that there is need for more information and who to contact from, at least from the UNEP side, I'm happy to help to get in touch with the participants and see if I can put them, connect them with my former colleagues in the UNEP team.
Thank you very much. Bernice, did you want to add anything?
Well, I mean, obviously more resources, more dedicated support, but I'm going to say what I said earlier: amplify the positives, name and shame the laggards. I mean, we have to somehow sharpen the toolkit a little bit if we really need and want to see progress faster. Thank you.
That's a wonderful way to end the session. Sharpen the toolkit. Absolutely. Well done. So I'd like to thank the audience for attending, and thanks especially to our wonderful panelists, Bernice and Amira and Danai. Thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to continuing these discussions, the very important discussions, in future. So thank you all, and good evening.